we still have plenty of time this morning to go through this presentation about chart of accounts and kind of the basic structure that we use in Munis. And so this presentation is one that I have used with, well, a lot of different groups. I've used this presentation in my district to train principals and school bookkeepers and administrators at the central office level to kind of help build that understanding about how Munis works or how the coding works and why it's so important. And I found that it really helps to kind of have this base knowledge underneath you. It makes it easier for you to understand the things that I think we are talking to you about as finance officers. And then I also think it makes it easier for you to read and understand Munis reports and things like that that you may, see or be given or have the ability to run even yourself. So I like to call, we're kind of got some building blocks here that we're going to talk about. And we're going to start off with, okay, my screen is frozen. Boy, I'm really having a great day today. Okay. Hold on one second. Well, that's an odd problem I've never had before.
If you need to email it to me, you can, and I can share it.
Okay. Oh. Hold on. Let me give me one more try here.
Sure, no problem.
All right, there we're going. Are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Okay. It was showing, it just wasn't moving the slides when I moved the slides. That was the strange thing it was doing. Okay, so it's going to be a Monday on a Wednesday today, isn't it? All right, so we've got chart of accounts, and we're going to start out with some building block pieces. And those are kind of our funds. So I kind of came up with this graphic to use in my district because, not all students learn the same, and some people like to sort of have a picture image in their mind. So I thought of funds as being like the trunk of a tree. That's your most basic level that you're tracking funds, and that's the highest level you've got there are the funds. So in my district, we currently have 9 different funds. Some districts won't have all of these, although most of these are pretty common in all districts. Everybody's got a general fund. That's always Fund 1. That's where your transportation dollars reside, or in the general fund. Special Revenue Fund, everyone has a Fund 2. That's where all your grants are, like Title I or Idea B or preschool. And you might occasionally have an instance where you could get a special grant or award for something specifically transportation related that could end up being put in Fund 2. We have a district activity fund. In my district, it's Fund 21. That's an annual fund. Some districts set that up as a multi-year fund, which we'll talk about what that means in a moment. And theirs might be Fund 22. Capital Outlay Fund, everyone has one of those. That's Fund 310. FSPK, which is Facility Support Program of Kentucky, that is Fund 320. Again, that's one everyone has. That's the fund where your bond payments are made to pay for your facilities. Construction Fund, Fund 360, is exactly like it sounds. If your district sells bonds to finance, let's say, the building of a new high school, they're going to be housed in that construction fund. A debt service fund, Fund 400, again, that's one that everyone has in their district, and that's where we actually make those bond payments from for the different buildings and projects that we've had built in our districts. And we actually pay the bond payments from debt service, and then we transfer the funds to cover those payments to that fund from the FSPK fund. Food service, another fund that everyone has. That's always Fund 51 in every single district. And then my district has a fiduciary fund, and I don't think there's really that many districts that have a fiduciary fund, but that's Fund 7000, and that holds some scholarship funds. So if your district does have a scholarship fund that you are the fiduciary for, that is usually housed in Fund 7000. So this is our most basic way of tracking funds, is just to talk about what fund they are in. Didn't realize I had all that animation on that slide. Okay. So the next level, if you want to think of it as having your tree having some branches that are growing out, are organization codes, or we just call them orgs for short. So orgs start to tell us more about how we're using the funds that we're talking about. So they narrow down information, and they tell us some very key things. They tell us what location that expenditure is for. They tell us what program does that expenditure support, what function does that expenditure support, and then it even tells us what grade level we'll be using this purchase. So as you said, we have a fund is our tree trunk, and so we start to get these branches out. We go further out on the little branches. We know more and more about what's going on with this expenditure, and we can do all that with this org code. Now, moving on from org codes, we get a little more specific, and we can move on to object codes, or as I use in my example, I like to think of them as kind of the leaves coming out on your tree. So object codes answer this question, basically. What is this for? So what are we purchasing is the question we're answering if we're talking about an expenditure. And really, when we're talking specifically about transportation, we're talking about purchasing, because you're not so much looking at the revenue side of things. But object codes also do exist for revenues. And in that case, we're answering the question, how are these funds raised? You know, where did they come from? How did we get these funds? Why do we have them? And then sometimes, this is kind of an optional thing, because as we know, not all trees have fruits or flowers that grow on them or anything like that, but sometimes we do. And so in that case, sometimes our expenditures have a project code, and you know that helps us further distinguish what that money is for. So it tells us specifically which pot of money in a fund we're spending or receiving from. So most of the time, project codes are used with Fund 2. So we think about the big projects that everyone's familiar with the name of them, even if they don't have any direct use of those funds, like Title I, Idea B for special education, preschool program, ESS for your extended school, after school type stuff. Those are your project codes. As a typical rule, those are usually in Fund 2, in that special projects fund. But you can also use project codes in any of the funds. For example, construction fund uses project codes to track the different projects that you have open, because you might be in a larger district. You may be building a high school and an elementary school and doing repairs to the HVAC system at a middle school. And so you might have multiple project codes going that help you track and keep those pots of money separate for one another. So in the grand scheme of things, you've got a big pool of funds in that fund, let's say in that construction fund, for example. But within it, you've got some smaller pots or buckets where you can say, well, this is the money that's devoted to that high school we're building, and here's the money we have to spend on it. Here's what we've spent so far, and it, helps you keep all those things separate and do a true accounting of that. So behind all of this, there is really a lot of structure that's working kind of behind the scenes. So org codes are 7-digit codes. So in Kentucky, in Munis, we use the short form, what's referred to as the short form. And each section of this org code tells us something about the purpose of that expenditure. So we're going to take a look at one of these. This is a really basic one on the screen here. This is for one of my schools, and in fact, it's for the elementary school that's across the parking lot from me right now. 140-1-118. So there's a lot of, it's a 7-digit number. There's a lot of information packed into that 7-digit number that I can tell you just from looking at that. And I'm sure if you've had conversations with your finance officer in your district or someone else in central office who's really familiar with Munis and uses it on a daily basis and, is always talking about the codes of things. They have so many of these memorized, it's probably mind-blowing to you. But they can spot this and say, oh, yeah, that belongs to so-and-so building, or oh, yeah, that's for this, or oh, yeah, that's for that. And it's because they know what's behind that code. They know how to read the secret code, so to speak. And that's what we're going to learn to do on these next few slides. I'm going to teach you the secret code. So, you can work on learning this for yourself. And you can be able to, look at a purchase order or something that's been coded and just in a matter of seconds tell a lot of information about that without having to look at anything other than the org code. So the first 3 digits represent the location that's making this expenditure. So each school has a state-assigned location number. So that 140 in this org code, that belongs to my school that's Jamestown Elementary, that's next door to our central office. We didn't make that number up. We applied for that from the state at some point, way back when we all went on Munis in the 90s. That number was assigned to us by the state to use for that location. Every school that you have in your district has a number like this. They'll all be different, so you can keep them all the same, or keep them all separate. Now, that doesn't mean that one of you all might not have the location in your district that's numbered 140. I don't know if you do, but that's probably a possibility. But there are some common locations that are used by all districts in the state, and that is, you'll see 000, as we call it. That always means district-wide. So that would be, if you were using this in an org code, district-wide, would be an expense for something that really was going to be shared by everyone in your district. So sometimes you use it for things maybe that you can't attribute just to one location or another, something that's going to be shared. You might think of it in case of salary. You don't want to always put a lot of salaries in a district-wide code because usually that person is working at a specific location or a combination of 2 or 3 locations that you can divide that in. But let's think about your superintendent in your district. Your superintendent works to support all of the schools in the district, so you might find your superintendent's salary is attributed to a district-wide code because you're not going to break that up and say, well, they spend 5% of their time on this elementary school and 3% of their time on that high school and all that kind of stuff. But rather you're going to say, well, their salary supports the whole district, so it's a district-wide expense. Another one that you have in every district is location of 001, and that's always your central office. And central office, it just helps us show where these people work. Like if you keep using the salary example, my salary is coded to a central office code. I'm really, supporting the whole district, so it could be to a district-wide code, and it still makes sense because that's kind of used the same way. But central office, if I see that code, I know, okay, well, that must be for something used in this building or someone who works specifically in this building. And then one that probably everyone on this call is familiar with, 901, is the bus garage, and that I think is standardized as far as I know across all the districts, that we all use 901 as the location for our bus garage. Now, there's a little more information in here. We just took care of the first 3 digits there. That tells us the location that's making this expenditure. The middle number tells us which fund is paying for that expenditure. So when we see a 1, we know it's for the general fund. If we see a 2, it's for our special projects or district activity funds. So when you get into something like 2 and 3 where you have multiple funds that start with that number, usually the first code of the next 3 there will help you indicate which fund that's for. But with, kind of keeping this geared toward transportation as much as I can, that's probably not something that's going to be a really relevant issue for you. In most things I feel like you're going to see a 1 there because all of your funds are going to be from the general fund. Or, as I said, you might have an occasion to see a 2 if there should be some type of special grant for something related to transportation. But if you see a 3, it could be capital outlay, could be the building fund, could be construction funds. When you see a 4, it's debt service. If you see a 5, it's for food service. And a 7 is going to be those fiduciary funds. Now, the last part of this org, those last 3 digits, we refer to that as a key code. So you may occasionally, if you go to a session, at some type of conference, if I know there's probably some finance officers on this call today, and maybe some of you all come to the CASBO Finance Officers Conference. I hope you do. I think we'd have a lot of information there that you might get a lot from to help understand Munis better. But that's called the key code. So you may hear that in a session sometime, key code. I remember way back when I started in this position, and when I started in this position, I didn't get a lot of training. There was kind of a situation going on in my district, and it was sort of like, yeah, here's the job, but there's nobody here to show you the ropes. We don't, there's really we don't know anybody to get to come help you and to be a mentor or anything like that for you. So figure it out. And so, I have figured it out as the years went on, but for a while, I remember going to sessions at things like CASBO, and I would hear people mention key code. And I didn't really know what they meant, but I felt like I was going to look stupid if I raised my hand and said, I don't know what a key code is. So eventually, I was looking through things I could find around the office that had been left by previous finance officers, and a lot of that was some really old dated items. And I found this really old handout from when we had implemented Munis in our district, and it was talking about chart of accounts. That's what it was called at the very top of it. It was called chart of accounts, and being the pack rat that I am, I think I kept it and stuck it here somewhere in my office because it was turned out to be such an important document to me. When I found it, it was like that light bulb moment went off, because there on the page it talked about the key code, and I'm like, that's what it is. Now I know. So I always make a point when I do a presentation about chart of accounts to mention that term key code, because you'll hear it used, especially from finance officers who've been around a while and know that terminology. And I feel like sometimes we maybe don't write that in places on training materials, and maybe newer folks are kind of lost if they hear the word key code. So I always try to make a point to talk about that. So the key code is that 118 part of this org that we're looking at here. And these 3 digits tell what program the expenditure supports. So there's some very common ones, and here's a few that I put out for us to look at. 118, the one from our example above, that means regular instruction. So this is where you're going to code or C-code it all, like the salaries for your teachers who are in the classrooms, just, the first grade teachers, second grade teachers. All their salary is going into that code at their specific location. 121 is special education instruction. So to use this example of Jamestown Elementary that's next door to me, all of the special education teachers at that school, their salary is coded to 140-1-121. So because that helps me when I see that, I know that teacher salary is coming from there. I immediately know that they're a special education teacher. 087 is another common one used probably in most districts, and that's for maintenance. So you've probably got that set up for every location in your district to help, and that's where you would purchase, let's say, your just basic supplies to support your building, everything from, cleaners to toilet paper and paper towels to the salary of your custodians probably comes from that code. Electricity is usually paid from that code for that specific building. So it kind of shows you, what the costs for maintenance at that specific building are. 077 is principal's office. Again, I would say every school has that set up, and that's where the pay for your principal and probably the office support staff is coming from that org as well. 031 is the counselor's office, and 059 is for library. So let's look a little more in depth here. Let's talk about some specific object codes. So after the 7-digit org code, you have a 4-digit object code. And as I said, these are the kind of the leaves that start coming out on our tree here. That's what tells us what we're purchasing. And some of these object codes are very, very specific, and some of them are really broad. So here's a good example of what I'm talking about there. We have an object code 0641 that says library books. Okay, that's very specific. A library book. I think we all know what that is. we're never going to look at something and question, should that be in that library book category or should that be in something different? Because if it's not a library book, we're not going to put it in that code. But then we have, I call this everyone's favorite object code, and probably your finance officer in your district would tell you it's a little bit the bane of their existence, and that's the general supply code, 0610. Because everyone, when in doubt, says, let's just stick it in general supplies. Let's put it in 0610. And so you end up with a lot of stuff in 0610 that probably has a better place for that expenditure, a more specific object code for that expenditure. Not every time. There's still a lot of things that truly are general supplies. For example, if your school, or even if your transportation office needs to buy some office supplies, you need some Post-its and you need some tape and some staples and some paper clips and just, copy paper. You need some things like that. That truly goes in general supplies. There's not a more specific category for those items. But what you run into is, I see things like people need a roll of stamps, and they'll just stick it in general supplies. Well, there's a better code for that. There's a code for postage. It's called postage and P.O. box rent. I'm pretty sure it's 0531, if I remember correctly. And like I said, those of us who've been finance officers for a while have a great amount of these things memorized, especially the ones that our district uses. Now, there are tons and tons of these object codes, and the goal, I always like to tell people, here's the goal for using your object codes correctly. Use the most specific and appropriate one that you can, but the idea is not to use every one of them in the book. I've run into that a couple of times in my district. When I start talking to the schools and to some of the grant coordinators and say, look, don't lump so many things in 0610 general supplies. There's better codes for this and that. Look at these and pick the best one. And then the next thing I know, we're getting a lot of purchase orders coming through that are using, like a different code for every item on the purchase order, which, can sometimes be the case. But it's almost like we've looked at it and said, there's a code here, 0625 for coal. How can I figure out how to use that? Oh, here's one for vending. How can I figure out how to use that? And it's almost like a game of let's see how many we can use. So you can take it too far in either direction. You can be too easy to lump things in a very general code when there's better, more specific codes to use. But then you can also get to kind of that splitting hairs sort of mode where you're getting down so close and you're being so granular with it and you're trying to put things, trying to use all these codes. You may not need to use that many codes. So specifically related to transportation, there are some that are very transportation specific, and I would imagine that these are the object codes that you would probably use most often for a lot of your purchases. So there is a special section in the 600 series, as we refer to it. So any of them that start 06, like these two examples, would be in the 600 series. So there's a section 066X, which are for vehicle supplies, and then the X, of course, changes. You've got 0661 for transportation lubricants, and that should be amounts paid for expenditures that include oil, grease, tire glide, etc., used in district vehicles. So the chart of accounts document that is on the KDE website, it's very good. And it last, I don't know, several years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, they kind of worked on the format of it a bit. And I think they really improved it because they have this nice uniform chart of accounts that you can print out, put in a binder. And I do actually keep this in a binder. I'm usually an advocate for don't print things out, keep it electronically. You can refer to it that way. But I use this so much that I do print one out every year. There's usually updates made to it that become effective July 1. There may be some key codes added or deleted or a few things tweaked on it. And when they put out that new version that's going to be effective July 1, I print a brand new copy and I change it out in my binder. This binder literally lays out on my desk all day, every day. People come in, asking questions. I don't really know how to code this, or what do you think this should be? And we look at it and I refer to it on a near daily basis. It's probably rare that I don't look over and refer to it. So, not all of it would I recommend necessarily that you print out as transportation directors and those involved in transportation. There are several sections of it that probably aren't relevant to you. But the section about the expenditure object codes is really good. And if you had nothing other than that section, I think that you definitely would be worth printing out. And I tell you what I will do after we get off here. I will pull this up on the KDE website, the thing that I'm specifically talking about, and I will send it to Elisa with my slides and make sure she sends that out so you know specifically which part I'm talking about here. But all the object codes, the ones that are a little vague and broad, there's a really good description written with most of those that can really help you understand if you're using that code correctly or if that's what it's meant to be used for. So like I said, that 066X series, that's the set that's going to be most relevant to transportation. We've got 0662 tires and tubes. There's no extra explanation with that one, but it's kind of like our library books example. It's pretty clear and straight, straight cut, not a lot of concern about what goes in there. 0663 transportation repair parts, and 0669 other transportation maintenance. Another one that might be relevant to the bus garage is 0435, which is vehicle repairs and maintenance, and it specifically says this is amounts paid for expenditures for repair and maintenance of vehicles apart from services provided by school district employees and not in the school bus transportation department. So I know sometimes our districts have a fleet of vehicles, so to speak, that we use. Some of them may be assigned to specific individuals, like your maintenance department. Each, couple of guys may have a truck that's kind of assigned to them to use. Or you may have some that are available for sign out for employees in your district to drive to meetings and things like that. And probably as a transportation director, you're kind of in charge of those, but they're not specifically related to the student transportation piece. And so you may, if you have to send one to the shop to have a repair, something that you're not able to do in-house, you may be using that 0435 code there. So it's a very good document. When they added those extra descriptions, I think, and really beefed it up, it became so much more usable, and it really became a lot better document for use by those who don't use Munis on a daily basis and who don't have that same knowledge about coding and things that people that work in finance do. But it's a great document, and I will pull it off the KDE website specifically because there's several documents there, and they're all named things that are very close, and it can be hard to pull the one that I'm talking about. So I'll definitely pull it off, and I'll email it so she can send that out to everyone because it's a wonderful document.
Marla?
Yes.
Yes, this is Elisa. I've also put the link into the chat if anybody wants to take a look at it.
Okay, great, great.
Also, at this time, if I can get everybody to put the color blue in the chat for attendance, I'd appreciate it. Go ahead, Marla.
All right, thank you. All right, so a little more about object codes. So the basic object code is 4 digits. They're never less than 4 digits, but they can actually be up to 6 digits. So you can customize an object code with a 5th or a 6th digit to allow for additional tracking and reporting. And then when you run reports, that 5th or 6th digit object code is rolled up into the basic 4-digit object code. So in my district, we used to use a 5th digit to help us track our Section 6 funds, which are the funds that we allocate to the school for their supplies and their needs through the allocation process. So we used to track it so I could run reports a little more easily, and so we could just not lump everything together into that 0610 code, which is when I first came here in my district and the schools were given supply money. Let's say Jamestown Elementary next door got $100,000 in supply money, which they would love because that's more than they get. But they budgeted it all in 0610, and that's where the money was. in the sense that's where it was put in the budget. So that's where we spent it all from. So if Jamestown Elementary was buying stamps, or they were buying library books, or they were paying for a field trip, or they were doing anything, buying computers, buying software, it went in 0610. And there were better codes for that. But it's, well, we budget it here. This is where our money sits. This is where all of our expenditures go. Well, that's where the money may be sitting, in the budget, but that doesn't mean that you don't still need to track the true expenditures of it in the appropriate way. Because, what is a budget? It's a plan for how you think you're going to spend your money. So, we can start the school year and we can think that all of the expenditures we're going to make truly will be in that 0610 general supplies category. But as the year goes on and we actually make our purchases, we realize that, well, part of my money I actually need to use to buy some stamps. Part of my money I need to use to buy some new computers or to upgrade these. We broke a few, we need some new ones. And you realize that where you put your money in your budget may not be where you need to make the expenditure. And sometimes you have to move your budget around, do some amendments. But trust me, your finance officer wants you to come to them and say, look, I need to buy this item, and this is the code that it really needs to be. All my money over here in the budget is in this code, and so I need to change that around because I want to capture this expenditure accurately. They're going to love it if you come to them and say that and are really talking about and thinking about that kind of thing. They're not going to be mad because they're going to have to make a budget amendment or move something around. They're going to be thrilled that you are thinking about actually capturing that accurately instead of just sticking it where you had budgeted money, because it makes life so much easier for them. And they know that the reports they're giving to people, district users, your board members, when it's used at the state level, when we're asked for information, we know and we feel, better that what we're turning in and telling someone is true and accurate, but when we don't lump these things together. So we did for a while in our district put a letter. And that's another thing to point. You can add that 5th or 6th digit. It doesn't have to be numerical. It can be alphabetical. So you could add, we added a J, and when I saw that, I knew that was for Jamestown Elementary. Or an H. We only have one high school in my district, so I just used H. I knew that was the high school, and that helped us to track that a little further. Now, there's a little bit better way to do that, and this is what we've transitioned to in my district, and that's to use a project code to track something. So unlike org and object codes, a project code does not have to be used for all expenditures. So nothing in your district, you cannot make a purchase without using an org code and an object code, but you can make plenty of purchases without having a project code. That's an optional piece of the puzzle. Generally, it tracks those grant funds in Fund 2, like I mentioned, or in construction. And probably you're using it in debt service fund to track which bond you're actually paying with those payments that you make in your district. But you can also use them in the general fund or in other funds to track other expenditures. Projects within the general fund do not have to be balanced, meaning you can track just the expenditure side without needing to have that offsetting revenue code. So if you think about Fund 2, let's talk about a grant. Let's say that we were to get a special grant to fund some field trips for elementary students for a specific reason. Let's say a local bank is going to give you $5,000 for elementary school field trips for the year. And you need to track that pot of money. So it goes in special revenue because it's been given to you by an entity for a specific purpose. So we can't just decide, oh, thanks for the $5,000, we're going to do whatever we want with it, right? So when it's in special revenue fund, someone has given you the money and they've told you specifically what they want you to do with it. So they've given us this money and they tell us these $5,000 are for field trips and they're for elementary school field trips. So we're going to put that in a special project code so we can track that. We're going to show a revenue of that $5,000 when they give it to us, and then we're going to have different expenditure orgs and objects to show which elementary school spent how much or how much we budgeted for each elementary school and then how much they ultimately spent on their field trips. And at the end, when we have finished that project and we have closed it, that project needs to balance to zero. If we received $5,000 in revenue to use on these field trips, we've got to spend $5,000 out of it so that the balance is zero. So sometimes, you know, it's kind of hard to spend things exactly to the penny. That's where you kind of have to split costs between the project, use what's left in the project, and maybe the school has to pick up a little bit of the extra to make it perfectly balance out to zero. But in those projects like that, in Fund 2, where you have a special project, you've been given a pot of money for a specific reason, they, at the end of the day, have to balance to zero. When all is said and done, when the year's closed, when the time frame to use that money is over, it must balance to zero. But if you want to just track the cost for something, you could do that with a project code, and you do not have to have a revenue side. So, for example, we're going to talk about how I do it in my district for one, but let's talk about where these come from. So special revenue project numbers are mostly grants. They're mostly assigned by KDE, but the district can assign local grant numbers if needed, and these should start with a zero. So in my example of a local bank who gives us $5,000 to spend on field trips, that would just be a local thing, right? They're only giving that to my district. No one else in another district is going to get that money. So I'm going to set that up so I can keep track of it with a project code that starts with a zero. And I'm just going to make that up myself in my district. So the fourth digit of these project codes tells us what fiscal year the grants are for. So it started in fiscal year 15, FY15. The fourth digit became a letter instead of a number. So when we first started using Munis for many years, we would use our project numbers would end in the last digit of that fiscal year. So we're in fiscal year 21 right now. So all of our project codes would end in a 1, and we would know that meant that that was grant money for fiscal year FY21. So if I had Title 1, for example, which is 310X, for this year it would be 31011. Well, that worked great, except of course every 10 years we need to reuse those, right? So we would delete all of that history. There was a process to go through to clear all that history out, and we would reuse those project numbers every 10 years. And that worked fine for a while until Munis changed kind of the way that they have some of the I guess you would call them data tables behind the scenes working in Munis, where they hold information and how it goes back and references that to pull that information to different programs into Munis. They changed some of that structure, and when they did that, it became very difficult, if not impossible, for us to truly get all that deleted without messing other things in our system up, because it was tied to so many more things. It wasn't just in a little silo setting there, and it was, you know, if you delete this, it doesn't mess anything else up. It's only connected to these projects. So we needed a new system, and someone came up with this idea that we would use letters instead of numbers. So in FY15, instead of that last digit being a 5, it became an A. And then in 16, we're on B and C and D and so on. And of course, we all know we're in, well, several of us know anyway, that we're in G. This year's G. Next year is supposed to be H, and we're going to be skipping over H because that is one that we sometimes would use as a holding project, because in that whole delete process, to delete it, you couldn't have had any activity in it for, I think it was like 4 years. So if you had, for some reason, touched that code, you know, even if you just keyed something to it by accident and that suddenly gave it activity, even if you corrected yourself later and zeroed it back out, it still had activity. You couldn't delete it. So sometimes you would have to transfer these projects into a holding project to just sit there for a few years until it was ready to be deleted again, until it was eligible for deletion. And so sometimes we would move those to a project and use an H to designate that that was a holding project. And so that's why we're not going to be able to use H. We're going to skip over that. We're also going to skip over X, because we also sometimes moved projects to something with an X to designate that that was a project that had been transferred from an old one that we couldn't delete. So you got those 0 series. That's going to be local grants. The things like where your bank might donate you some money, that happens occasionally. You might have a business in your district that might donate some money to a specific school or for a specific purpose that's going to be set up as a local grant. Anything in the 1000s are your state grants. And then 2,000s to 5,000s are the federal grants. And so here's some examples. 120D or is ESS. So this year's ESS money is 120G, for example. 310D is Title I, 401D would be Title II, 550D is 21st century. If you still have 21st century, we used to have quite a bit of that, and we lost all of our 21st century grants, so we don't have that one anymore to deal with. But those, ESS, Title I, Title II, those are pretty standard. I would say almost every district has those set up in your district. So I mentioned when we started talking about orgs that Kentucky uses the short form, but that means there's also a long form. So I want to show you what the long form is, just to show you that that 7 digits that we use has a lot of information that we can see. We talked about what all those 7 digits tell us, and it tells us a lot on the surface. But underneath that, there is the long form connected to it back behind the scenes in Munis. And that really tells us a lot more about what's happening behind there. So in our example, just to keep using my elementary school, 140-1-118-0610, right? So I see this and I say this is for Jamestown Elementary. This is a purchase coming from Fund 1. It's for regular instruction because I see that 118 key code, and it's in the general supplies. So it could be something very broad. It's in the 0610. Really behind the scenes, here's what that looks like. You see a lot more pieces of information in there. And I think it probably makes us all appreciate that short form, because even though we're looking at, 7 and 11 digits up there in the short form for this, there's a whole lot more when we actually look at what the long form is. Now, you can see the long form in Munis if you have access to the program account inquiry and you go to search an account. Like if I were to search this account here to look at something, up at the top of that program, over in the header on the right side, it'll show you what the long form is. So those of you who maybe have Munis access and maybe can use the account inquiry program, if you're curious, pull up a couple of your codes that you use all the time. There's something that you're familiar with, and glance over there and look at that long form. Or maybe you've noticed it before and not known what it was. But it's there on the screen, and here's what all these pieces tell us. So the one there that you see at the beginning is the fund. That's pretty easy to pick out of there probably. The 140, that's the location. Then we've got 1100. That's the function. So we haven't talked about the function. We'll probably talk a little more about it here in a couple of slides. I think there's a little more information about functions. Function is something that we don't talk about really on a daily basis. But function is the level that a lot of our state users of our information are interested in. We're always talking about, for example, we talk about the amount of money spent on instruction, right? You'll hear that when the legislature meets and they're discussing the budget, or, you'll hear maybe the governor's proposal for the budget. You hear talk about, we want the amount of money spent on instruction to go up. We want the amount of money spent on administrative costs to go down, for example. They're talking about that functional level. We don't, on a daily basis in our districts, talk about the function. That's because that function is set up behind the scenes, and we're using that function every day, but we don't necessarily know it and talk about it. So this particular org here, the 141-118, is tied to that 1100 function because it's regular instruction. Instruction, goes back to that 1100 is the instruction function. So it's all tied together behind the scenes. And then we've got the 100 here is the program. Okay, so program is another one of those behind the scenes levels. It's a bigger bucket, if you will, a way of grouping things together. We don't talk about the program all that much, and it's not used as widely as talking about the function, even for things at the state level. The one time we hear the program talked about, maybe special education costs, those are all tracked by a specific program number in or series in Munis. And so a lot of times that'll be discussed in reference to telling if an expense is in the special education program versus other programs. The 10 there tells you the instructional level, and then the 0610 is our object code. So, when we use that short form, we're not having to memorize and keep up with that function, program, and instructional level on a daily basis. That's all set up behind the scenes, and once it's set up, it's done. So in this document I was talking about, or one of the other documents, I think it's actually a separate document from the one that talks about the descriptions of the object codes, but there's a listing of all the key codes. And all of the key codes, it'll tell what's the program, what's the function, what's the instructional level that goes with all these. And so when a new one is set up in your system, which is probably only going to be done by the finance officer or someone specifically designated in your district to do that, you want to get that out. You want to reference it as you set a new one up because you want to tie it to all the correct things. Assuming that you don't already have one set up in that way, Munis would let you tie this to the wrong function. If you key it in wrong and it doesn't conflict with another one, then you could absolutely set this up and have this tied to the wrong function. And if you do that and you use it in your district and you run reports on that functional level, it's reporting things in the wrong position. So, it's one of those things, you sort of a fix it and forget it type thing. You set it up correctly on the front end, you don't ever have to worry about it again. And of course, these can be, I found one or two in my district that are incorrect, have been incorrect. And I'm not saying they were incorrect when they were initially put in the system. But like I said, there are updates done to this about once a year. They usually become effective at the beginning of the new fiscal year, so on July 1. And there've been, times when we've taken let's say a function has been updated, maybe we split it out a little more, or maybe it got deleted or changed. And that means that you needed to make some changes to your existing information. If it was something that you really weren't using, you probably didn't make note of it and get it changed. So I don't know that they were initially set up incorrect so much as there was an update to the chart of accounts that didn't get followed through with in the system. So there are some utilities and things in Munis to help make those changes, because once you set one of these things up, you really have very little, you can't just go in there and click update and modify it. You've got to use special programs. Everybody's got to be out of the system because it is changing the structure of all that information that Munis is collecting on the back side. And so if you go messing with that, it's a very big deal. So that's why it's so important to set these up correctly from the get-go. So behind the scenes, let's talk about these things behind the scenes there. First, let's look at functions. So it tells us what the expenditure supports. That 1000 series is instruction. The 2000 series has instruction support services. A couple common ones, 2100s are the student support services. 2700s, that's the ones that's really relevant to our group today. That's the student transportation functions. And so function is how expenditures are reported on the AFR, which is the annual financial report that you may hear talked about in your district, and the monthly financial report. So the AFR, we do that once a year when we close the year. That's got to be the unaudited version, at least, is supposed to be sent to Frankfurt by July the 25th each year. So when we close the year on June 30th, we have a very short time period there to get all the things done we have to get done, and we generate that AFR and send it in. It groups all of our expenditures by function, basically, and that's the level at which our state users of our information at KDE, that's generally the level they're looking at. Now, the monthly financial report basically mirrors that report, or is very, very similar, but it's one that you can run on a monthly basis. That's one of the board reports that I give my board members, is the monthly financial report, and that's because it is like the AFR, which they see. So, if you can learn to read the AFR, you can read the monthly financial report and vice versa. And so, the function's a higher level look at expenditures than what we usually use internally on a daily basis. It collects it by what it's for. It says this is for instruction. This is how much we're spending on student transportation. It doesn't get down to that granular level of saying this is how much we're spending on tires and tubes and this is how much we're spending on lubricants, because at the high level user, they don't care. They just want to know how much you're spending on transportation. They care about things like, is it going up? Is it going down? Is it staying kind of flat? That's kind of the thing that they're looking at. They're not getting down to that nitty gritty of, wow, you spent a lot more on tires and tubes this year than you did last year. Why is that? that's the question you're answering internally in your district. That may be the thing that your finance officer comes to you and says, hey, I was just, running some reports and kind of keeping an eye on things, and I noticed that you've got a lot more expenditures for tires and tubes right now than you did at the same point last year. What gives with that? What's the reason? And you may have some very valid reasons. It could be, well, we just, got to a point we had a lot of tire changes had to be done this year. Could be you've had some, issues. Could be you keep so many on stock, and it's just like, well, we'd used up everything we had on hand, and we restocked ourselves, if that's something that you keep stocked. You may have a very valid reason. But at a high level user, like say your board members, for example, they need to be more focused on that overarching look of things and saying student transportation costs are up. Well, they're really up this year. Why are they up so much? And maybe it's you added a new bus route, or maybe there's you've got older buses because you've not been purchasing new buses and keeping that kind of refreshed like you should on that schedule, and it's kind of coming back to haunt you now. Maybe you're having a lot of repair costs because you've not been investing, in keeping things in good working order for the future. So, there's a lot of factors there. But function is more of a high level look at things, and that's the talk that you hear when you hear things like the state legislature asking about cost and all that. They're talking about that functional level as a general rule. The program, it's exactly what it sounds like. They give more specifics on which program's making the expenditure, kind of like object codes. Some of them are crazy specific, and some of them are very broad. Here's a good example of that. You have 100, which is regular programs, which encompasses a lot of things, just like all your classroom teachers. That's under that regular programs category. But then you have one called Program 104, which is string and orchestra programs. So very, very specific. Many, many, many of our districts probably are never going to use anything connected to Program 104 because we may not be big enough to truly have a true string and orchestra program that we're tracking so separately from just regular band things. So it's kind of, like I said, kind of a lot like object codes. Some of them are really broad, and some of them are very, very specific. And then the instructional level, it tells you what grade level the expenditure is for. These are the common ones. 10 is elementary school, 20 middle school, 30 for high school. 00, I believe it is just all instructional levels. So you see that one used sometimes. It's for everyone. It's not specific to any particular grade level of student. And I want to just briefly, and I really do mean briefly, talk about revenue codes, because really we're always focused on the expenditure side of things, and that's the side that as transportation administrators that you're going to be coding things is going to be about expenditures. You're not going to be coding revenues, or at least I think it would be very out of the ordinary for you to have any coding of revenues coming in. Because even if you were receiving a revenue, let's say you had billed someone for a field trip and they paid you and you had a check to turn in, you're going to put, you've got a process to get that check to central office or wherever it goes. You're probably not the one entering it in the Munis system, so you're probably not putting the code on it. But revenue codes, I just want you to be sure to know that they exist. They're a lot more basic than the expenditure codes. Here's an example of one, 1101121. So there's still 7 digits. The first 3 of that is called the org of it. So the org, instead of being 7 whole digits, is only 3. And then those 4 digits, 1121, that's the object code, so to speak. So the first 3 tell us what fund is receiving the revenue. So 110 tells me this is going to the general fund. If I saw a 220, that means it's going to something in the special projects fund. It's going to one of those grants. And the last 4 tells where the revenue is coming from. So 1121 is utility tax. And just like the expenditure objects, there is a specific, revenue code. There's not as many of them as there are for expenditures, but there are some pretty specific ones. And there's a lot in here that we don't use. We don't use. I don't know if we even use 10% of them in my district. There's a lot of them to split out different kinds of tax revenue that you have coming in. If you think about where the revenues in your district come from. They either come from the state through the SEEK program, which has its own object code, which is 3111, or you have a lot of different kinds of taxes coming in. You have property tax, you know, your tangible tax, you've got utility tax, motor vehicle tax, we get a telecom tax, and we specifically split all those out and kind of keep track of it. And then, of course, you're going to have some, I guess you could call them kind of miscellaneous items. There is a code just for miscellaneous revenues, which sometimes just don't have a better home in any of the other codes. You've got a code probably to take in revenue for field trips that you've billed people for. You've got one for, let me think of what else we might have. You just don't have, I mean, you don't have a ton of different ones. My district gets some impact aid funds, so that's some federal revenue that we get that comes to our general fund, but not that many districts get that, and that's money we receive because we have a large lake here, and so we're missing, it's federal property, so they give us that money basically to make up for the fact that we can't tax that property in our district because of the lake. So, you know, there's not a whole lot of revenue sources, and that's why they can all be a little more basic. And they all, behind the scenes, at least in my district, mine are all like this. They all use the location of central office of 001. Your district may have them all tied to a location of 000, that 000 for district-wide. That's kind of immaterial. They all have a function of 4 zeros, a program of 3 zeros, an instructional level of 00. So those location, function, program, instructional level, those pieces of things that are really important on the expenditure side because they can help us track those expenditures into these buckets, we don't care about it on the revenue side. You don't receive revenue. Like, for example, let's talk about SEEK revenue. That's something we're all familiar with. When we receive SEEK revenue, it comes in, mine at least in my district, and I would say this is pretty much the case in all of our districts, I get 3 deposits each month to make up my SEEK money. I get the big basic chunk of it. I get a piece that's for transportation, and I get a piece that's the tier 1 piece of it. So some districts, I don't know, maybe don't get that tier 1 piece or something, but I get those 3 deposits. I put them all in the same revenue code. They all go in 1103111, and that SEEK code in my general fund. But when that money comes in, it's just for the general use of the general fund, right? We don't specifically say, okay, well, we got $800,000 in SEEK revenue today. $200,000 of it is for Jamestown Elementary. $300,000 of it is for Russell Springs Elementary. $400,000 of it is for my high school. We don't split that out by location. It just goes into the general pot for everybody's use. And, you know, we've decided how much each building or location gets to use by how we've budgeted for it at the beginning of the year. So on a revenue side, that location and the function, all that, it's just not really relevant information. It just doesn't really matter like it does on the expenditure side. Here are some common ones. I mentioned the 3111 already, SEEK. 3200 is restricted state revenue. So you see that one in the Fund 2 Special Projects Fund. Like I used the example earlier of talking about the ESS grant, which is one of the state grants, the 120X grant. So when we receive revenue for that, it goes in revenue code 220 because it's in Fund 2, 3200 because it is restricted state revenue. It is just to be used with that program. And then it has a project number attached of that 120X, with X being whatever the year is that money is for. 4500 works the same way, and it's typically seen in Fund 2 for special projects like Title I, Idea B, and all those. So I would put money in, let's say, in Title I, 220, 4500, 310G would be this year's Title I money. So here's a couple just common errors. These are probably not going to be all that relevant to us today, but transfer codes. If you have a transfer code, the total expenditure objects of 0910 has to equal the revenue objects of 5210. Probably not going to be really an issue with anything transportation related, but that is one time where those have to balance out between funds. So let me give you an example of where this would be used. Probably you've heard of having the CATS technology money that's allocated per district. What they kind of give us, they call it an offer. So if you've been to a board meeting or, heard it maybe on the news talking about what happened at the board meetings, you may have heard, the board accept an offer, a CATS technology offer. So they'll offer the district, I'm just going to use an easy dollar amount, let's say $50,000 for their first offer. And in order to get that $50,000, you have to transfer $50,000 from the general fund over to that project. It's kind of a matching situation. And so you've got to, have your $50,000 coming from an object as an expenditure in Fund 1, and it's a revenue in Fund 2 in that special project where you put it. Those have to balance each other out. So if I accidentally transferred $45,000 from one place and had it budgeted for 50 on the other, it will kick it out because it's out of balance, but not really going to be a big deal for you in transportation. All right, so I do want to talk for a second about, I mentioned it kind of as we went along, but I do want to mention this again, why this is so important for our codes to be correct, why you want to go to the trouble to look at what you're purchasing and look at these available object codes and say, okay, the best code for this is to put this in, tires and tubes instead of just putting it in general supplies. And don't get me wrong, you all will have things that you purchase for the bus garage, for the maintenance of buses that really don't have a better home to go to than 0610. There are some things you need that go in 0610 for general supplies. But, it's important because there's so many users of this information that we maybe don't think about. And one that I always try to mention when I'm talking to a group, especially if I talk to people in my district, I think we're all familiar with the term school report card, right? Especially your principals, building level folks. There's a lot of work goes into the school report card about, all the different pieces of data. So one of the things I try to highlight when I've talked in my district and tried to stress how important this is, that's how I approached it with my building people, is I talked about school report card. Because school report card, you got a lot of numerical data there, but from a financial side, from the side that I'm very familiar with, we come up with several, it used to be one number per building of a per pupil spending amount. Now we come up with 7 different per pupil spending amounts for school report card. So we used to be saying, okay, at Jamestown Elementary for the last fiscal year, we spent $5,000 per pupil at that building. And for Russell Springs Elementary, we spent $5,250 per student at that school. So obviously, you kind of want those numbers to be as fair, I guess you could say, and even across your district as you can, especially I would think at the same instructional level. So, my district, we have 3 elementary schools. So if I have one elementary school that we're spending twice as much per pupil at that school as we are the other 2 schools, that doesn't look very good. That raises a lot of questions. It raises a lot of questions of, are you favoring that school? Are you giving them more for some reason? At a state level, if they see those numbers and they look at it, they got questions. Is it a school that's really, really small and it has a very few students, and therefore your administrative costs are really, having a principal and all the staff you have to run a school? Are you down to the number of students where it doesn't make sense to do that anymore? And for a time, we used to have 4 elementaries. We had a school that was like that. The cost of having the principal and the necessary staff for the office and all the, custodial and all the stuff you had to have to operate a building, it was really inflating that number to the point that, we were spending more per pupil on students in that building, a lot more than we were any of our other elementary schools. And it kind of highlighted to us that we may have to look at this and start thinking about needing to close this school, because when you've only got like 100 students or 110 students at a school, there's a lot of overhead costs that don't really go down when you have a drop in your number of students. That's one thing. School report card, when you look at that, I think that's why it's one of the big reasons it's so important to correctly code this. And another reason is just when we report things at the AFR, and it's all reported by that function, if we've tied a lot of things to the wrong, orgs and objects and things behind the scenes, and they're not truly going in the functions that they should be going in, it can really give the wrong picture to our legislators, because that AFR data, KDE has all that, and it's all in the same format when they get it, and it makes it pretty easy for them to kind of aggregate it together and make statements or give data and say things like, across the board, across the state, we spent X dollars in instruction last year. Across the state, we spent X dollars in student transportation, and we only funded student transportation at this much. So look how much more we're spending on student transportation than what we're actually being funded for. And they can use that information and go to the legislature and say, we need more funding for student transportation because it's costing our districts, $150 million, and we're only funding $100 million of it. And I know those are crazy, I think, low numbers. I'm just pulling numbers to make an example. But that's kind of why it's important. If we were to somehow mess up in our district and get a lot of transportation costs being, let's say, coded to the schools, and they got connected to an instruction function, well, now it looks like we're really spending a lot on instruction, which might be looking good for our district, but then we're not giving an accurate reflection of what it really costs us to transport our students. And so we may be saying, hey, we need more money for student transportation, but the data that we're being able to give someone to show it isn't illustrating that. And that's why it's so important to get things in the right place. And, we have lost pots of funds. We don't get, or at least we haven't in the last couple of years, and I will be honest, I have very little faith in us ever getting this back, the pot of money that we had for textbooks and the pot of money that we had for professional development that came from the state. Those were kind of axed, I don't know, 3-4 years ago now, as some budget cuts. And I think we have very little hope of getting either of those back. And, one of the problems is if we are buying, let's take textbooks as a good example. Districts are buying textbooks. They're buying, instructional materials. It's really not just textbooks anymore. They renamed it instructional resources, because textbooks just aren't a book like we all remember when we went to school. Now it's a lot of, we may have online books that we use or online programs that we use in place of your classic, paper textbook that we're taking home with us that weighs a ton. But, if we're just coding, if the things we are purchasing that are the equivalent of our textbook, that instructional resource that we're buying, if we don't code that properly, there's a special code for textbooks, but if we don't use it and we just say put it in 0610 in that good old general supply category that we all love so much, well, when KDE is going to the legislature, they're going to the governor's office or wherever they're going to lobby for us as a district, and they're saying we need more money for instructional resources and textbooks. We need this money back. You took it away from us 4 or 5 years ago, but we need it. There's a need. Look at how much districts are spending on this. They can't tell how much districts are truly spending on textbooks if we aren't coding it to the proper codes to be able to show them. So, if we all coded incorrectly and it looks like across the state we spent $5 million on textbooks, when in reality we spent more like $25 million on textbooks. But because it's all coded in the wrong place, we can't pull that data together and we can't show that. We're not helping ourselves. We're not giving ourselves any way to get that funding back or to get additional funds or new funds that we've never had for something before. So it is really important. And I would just always tell all of you, develop a good relationship with your finance officer. They want to help you. I promise they do. They want you to learn how to read the munis codes. They want you to understand them. And to do that, you're going to have to ask questions, and don't be afraid to ask questions. And, the more questions you ask and say, hey, I really want to learn how to read this munis report and what that means. Will you sit down with me and help me look at this, codes? I can't imagine any of the finance officers I know or have ever met or had a conversation with who would say, absolutely not, I don't have time for that. They'll make time for that because we love it when people in our district want to know how it works because it saves us work. Because when you code it correctly on the front end and it's all in the right place, it gives me the confidence in the reports that I'm running and the numbers that I'm telling other people in the district when I'm asked. If I'm asked by board members, how much are you spending on tires and tubes? If we've got it coded correctly and I feel confident we have it coded correctly, I can pull up that report, shoot off that number and say, here's how much we spent. But if I know that, well, sometimes we're coding it that way, but sometimes we're sticking it in general supplies or sometimes we're sticking it here or there, I can tell them what's in that code, but I don't feel real good about it. So then I have to do a lot of work. Maybe I have to run some reports and hand pull some things and dig through and say, well, in the actual code, we have $20,000, but over here in general supplies, I think there's another $10,000 that actually needs to be over there with this. There's a lot of cleanup work, let's say, for your finance officer. If they identify those things and really want to move and get it right, I mean, it can be moved, it can be cleaned up, but it's more work to clean it up than it is just to do it right in the first place. So, study up on this. Once you get the hang of it, it's going to make, I think it's going to make it all so much easier for all of you, for any of you that aren't really familiar with these codes and it feels like a foreign language to you. And I know a lot of you may say, I'm not a numbers person. I'm just not a financial person. That's just not my thing. That's not my area. And it doesn't really have to be your area. But if you could get the hang of just these few numbers, I would imagine that it'll take a lot of stress off of you. And you, instead of just every time you have to deal with purchase orders and budgets and things, maybe having that little bit of panic and feeling like, oh no, I'd hate this part of my job. I don't understand this, and this is so confusing, and I don't know if I'm doing this right. You can learn to have that confidence and say, oh, yeah, this is no big deal. I can take care of this, and then I don't have to think about it anymore. So I encourage you to do that. I encourage you to, sit down and talk with your finance officer. Ask them to walk you through this code specifically for your department and what your orgs are and what your objects are and which objects are with which org, and talk about, is that the way they need to be? Is it possible you need to change something around? That would be, I think, a really valuable conversation for any of you to have in your district. So that is all I have. I'm happy to answer some questions if anybody has any. I don't know if anyone's put any in the chat or anything like that.
Okay, Marla, thank you. So I don't have anything in the chat yet, but first things first, put red in the chat so that we can do our attendance. And Marla has given you all homework as well, which is pretty much what we were going to do for you. But if you have questions, please feel free to unmute at this time or put them into the chat. Your homework for this month, and we will meet back up on March 17th, is to go back, pull up the report Marla was just talking about, read it, understand it, and ask your questions, okay? Open up those conversations with your finance officers and understand what it is that you're putting in and understand what it is that they need you to put in, okay? So do we have any questions at this time?
I've got a quick question. How do I access the chat?
Okay, if you have chat, several people have emailed me and stated they don't have chat. Okay, I'm going to share my screen really quick, and your screen may look different depending on the version that you have. Okay, my version has chat here at the top. It looks like a little tablet next to all the people. In some cases, it may be down here where your mute button is or your camera is. If you don't have either, just send me an email and I will respond back.
A webinar, but I want it more something this way.
Someone is not on mute, so we're going to go ahead and mute them unless they have a question.
I have a quick question, please.
Sure.
Marla, could you review again what the first 3 numbers represent in the org code? I did not get that part.
Oh, absolutely. The first 3 numbers tell your location for your expenditure. So, for example, I mentioned that there are some common ones across the board. So for bus garage, it's probably 901 is anything bus related in your district. We'll have that 901 is the first 3 digits, and that's your location. So the first 3 is a location.
I'm not sure if
That's the
it was.
thing, when I do a memo.
One moment, please. I'm going to mute. Okay, I think I got the right person. Go ahead, Marla.
Okay, so the first 3 digits in your org tell the location. So, you know, if you're a principal in a school, you're going to just use your one school. Most, at least in my district, and I say that we're probably doing the same as most other districts. At least that's what I gather from conversations I have with my colleagues. All of our transportation costs are attributed to the 901 location or the bus garage location. So you probably, if you've got Munis reports that you've seen, if you look at the org, they probably all start 901, 1, and then something after that for that 3-digit key code.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Oh, I'm not trying to do my doctor's appointment.
Yes. Judy, did you have a question? Okay, I'm going to mute her again. So before anyone leaves, it's very important that you hear this, okay? We've already had, goodness, 20 people leave, and I don't have all of the surveys. I just put up in the chat a survey that I need you all to fill out for your attendance, okay? This is to give us your name, your email address, whether you need ELA, okay? Those are the important things, but that's also going to tell us that you attended today. If we do not get that, I cannot show that you attended today, okay? Because as you guys leave, it says that you leave, okay? So I need you to fill that out so that we have a good attendance. I've only got 35 people of the 120 people that were in this class showing that they had attended. Those of you who aren't seeing the chat or that don't see your answer in the chat, please just send me an email and we will get that recorded. Sometimes when there's over 100 people in the chat, it doesn't always have the chat option. So if you don't have the option, don't worry, you can email me, and that's for any of these going forward. If you don't have the chat option for whatever reason, I watch my email throughout the class to ensure that we're answering your questions as well, or you can unmute at any time. So it is 12 o'clock on the nose, which is where we wanted to be. So be sure to fill out the survey. If you don't see the survey, send me an email. I will email you the link, okay? I want to make sure that everybody gets it. What I'm also going to do, because many of you received the invitation for this meeting or for this training via either a forward or through the one of the listservs, everyone that fills out the survey is going to receive an invitation for the whole series, okay? So it will be on your calendar for the first Wednesday of every month. And if we need to change it for whatever reason, you will be able to see any changes. You know, with crazy weather and COVID and things like that, you just never know what happens. So you will all receive an invitation. And if you already have an invitation, I'm sorry if it sends you a second invitation, but I want to make sure it's on your calendar. And you can just leave it there. If you decline, make sure you put for that occurrence versus the whole series, because you won't get the whole series. You won't know the link for the whole series. Okay. Any other questions? Marla, thank you so much. It was so informative. I greatly appreciate it. And for everyone that attended, we appreciate you. We appreciate the time that you've taken to expand your knowledge and to work with the finance officers and understand what it is that they need from you. And we have Wayne, who will probably have a few parting words as well.
Yeah, I'll echo that. We appreciate everybody being with us today. And there were several questions about finance hours and ELI hours. We will send that out at the end of this series. Again, KPT will send out the finance hours, and then I think Alyssa probably will send out the ELI hours. If not, KPT can do both. So she's shaking her head yes. So they will do the ELI hours, and KPT will be doing the finance hours, and it'll be similar to the certificate you received with the KPT seminars we had earlier. So again, we want to thank everyone, and please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alyssa if you've got questions. KPT is here to serve transportation directors and their staff to help them fulfill their duties and their job duties. So we just want to make sure you understand your positions if you're a new director. And again, you can reach out. There are several people around the state that we can connect you with that can help you through KPT or KDE or STAC as well, as far as that goes. But again, we appreciate it. Thank you. And we will see you next month, hopefully.
Have a wonderful afternoon and stay safe and stay warm.